Hi guys, and welcome back to the stool testing series. In today's video, we're going to talk about the GUT ZOOMer version 3.0 from Vibrant Wellness. This one's a little bit sad, honestly, because I was really excited when I first took a look at this test. I thought it looked really great. And I have now basically come to the realization that I don't think I'm going to recommend it in my clinical practice. I'll show you why. I'll show you some of the pros and cons and where I think that it's useful and maybe less useful. So let's dive right into my GUT ZOOMer that I did on myself. So I'm not violating, some HIPAA contract here. But when we get into it, here's the first page of actual information and data for you. And you can see that they have two different measurements of gut diversity. So that was really nice that you get two different ways to look at your gut diversity. You can see that mine is a little bit, but I mean, you guys have followed me for a while. You probably know this, but I was a very chronic antibiotic kid. I had a lot of ear infections. I had a lot of sinus infections. So I'm cutting myself some slack on these. I eat in a way that favors diversity, but there's just some damage that you can't undo from a young life of antibiotics. But moving on over here, the phyla are really useful, and I like to do this. For those of you who watched my Thrive videos, you would have noticed this. And also this test does give us this information. So they give us this broad eagle eye overview of the gut microbiota, and that's a really nice way to just get a rough understanding of where you're at. Firmicutes, for example, in this sample for me was about 50%, which is D, so I would like that a teeny bit higher, but not bad. Bacteroidetes were about 42%. Actinobacteria right about 2%, and proteobacteria right about 3%. And the others, honestly, I don't know as much about, so I tend to kind of skip over them. But, for the most part, I'm telling patients that the Firmicutes are usually the good guys in the microbiota. They're going to be your vitamin producers, your short-chain fatty acid producers for the most part. So they are usually good things to have around. Bacteroidetes are kind of neutral. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good, but they're all kind of like a mixed medium bag cohort. And then proteobacteria are really, truly the bad guys of the ecosystem. You really don't want these above 3, maybe 4% tops. So I'm really glad that this test gives that phylum overview so you could see the bird's eye view of what the ecosystem looks like. So I thought that was really nice. The ratios over here I'm going to graze over just because I tend to look at the numbers over here rather than the ratios between the two, but it can be useful potentially. They have this comment here that I have an increased risk for IBS, which is pretty funny because you guys know my story. I had IBS years ago, not necessarily now. So that's moderately useful. This is an interesting part that they've put together here, and this is one of the things I don't love about the test, actually. They give these nice little, graphs where they say, your basically your microbiome's risk of inducing poor metabolic health or neurological health or inflammatory bowel disease or messing up your hormones. I get the intent that they're trying to go for here, but I think that they're maybe putting the cart before the horse. And also there are certain things for example, SIBO. We cannot judge the presence of SIBO based on a stool test. It stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, for crying out loud. You can't say that what is showing up in a stool sample is reflective of what's in your small bowel. And this is one of the companies that actually makes that leap and says that they are kind of roughly assessing that. And I don't think that's accurate. I think that's in poor taste. And the studies, there have been studies where they take aspirates along the small bowel, the colon, and compare that to stool sampling, and it's not at all the same. The stuff that you have in your ecosystem varies from location to location, and I really do take issue with the fact that they put a SIBO portion on this test. I think that's incredibly misleading. But some of the others, nutrition, liver health, IBS, IBD, yeah, why not? You can see I had one pathogen, kind of tabling that. Now for this is actually the part of the test that I felt they really shine in. So they do a nice job of assessing inflammation, and some of them are unique ways that other tests are not really looking at. So you might recall from the Genova videos or the GI map video, for example, Calprotectin is measured in a lot of different tests. Lactoferrin I've seen measured before. Even fecal eosinophilic protein X I have seen measured before on, say, Genova. But some of these other ones like MMP9, this, S100A12, lysozyme, beta defensin 2, like those are actually pretty unique to this test. I have not seen this nice of an inflammatory panel before on another test. So I was really quite happy to see that they were measuring inflammation in a more broad way, which was really kind of cool. Now, the markers here, you can see digestion. They give you some insight on your pancreatic enzyme sufficiency, whether or not you have meat fibers showing up in your stool. That would be reflective largely of low stomach acid or inadequate chewing, or both. And then vegetable fibers, you can see I actually had some detected in my sample. And then you can see that when something comes back abnormal or atypical, then you come over here and they give you commentary on it. And that's a really nice thing for both the doctor and the patient, because A, it gives the patient the information that they need. And not every doctor is going to be really good at explaining all of the details of the test. But for somebody like me who does write very, very thorough notes about the test results, it's nice for me because it kind of takes a load off for me. I don't have to worry about typing all this in my notes because it's provided already as part of the test. So that's nice as well. The total fecal fat, and then the different, triglycerides, fatty acids, cholesterol, phospholipids. That's a really nice way to break down the potential of fat malabsorption. And you can see that this was just out of the range for me. So that is something also that I'm kind of working on. Actually, side note, I have been trying to manage my stress more recently and realizing how it's affecting my gut again. I'll do a video on that one of these days soon. But I actually started taking some betaine HCl more recently, in part because of what was found on this test. So that was an interesting and useful note. Now you can see down here they have bile acid metabolites. And again, this is something that you don't see on a lot of other tests. They give you this nice breakdown. And one of the things about bile acids to know is that some bile acids are going to escape to your feces, and that's normal. But a lot of them should be reabsorbed by the time it makes it out of the stool. And also, some of the bile acids can be broken down and then consumed by less than stellar bacteria. So like Bilophila wadsworthia, for example, is a bile consumer, or it goes up in a high bile environment. So you could kind of put the thoughts together there. Now you could see that my one bile acid here was actually low. So that's okay. I'm not sweating that too much, but that could be related to the apparent mild fat malabsorption that we saw on the other page. So that could be something to bear in mind too. And you can see right here, they even said, consider supporting with betaine HCl. And that's exactly what I've done already. So I do think that is appropriate for me in this instance. Now, getting into the short chain fatty acids, this is something that I'm going to talk about more in my BiomeFX and my Somagen panels, which I finally just got Somagen back in and I could compare all of them. But this, I go back and forth with this, and I actually talked to the woman at the lab about this, and there's I believe it's Lucy Mailing has a nice blog article about this topic, about whether or not it's really useful to measure short chain fatty acids in stool, and her take on it was no. The reason being is that this is not indicative of only your production, it's also indicative of your absorption. So it could be that I'm making a normal amount of butyrate, God, I hope so, but maybe I'm just absorbing it like a freaking champion, right? And now less of it is getting out in the feces. Similarly, I could be making a normal amount of propionate, but I'm excreting more of it in stool. So, I do really wonder about that variable. I think that the other tests, like the whole genome sequencing, the shotgun sequencing tests like BiomeFX or Somagen, are going to be more useful for something like that, because it looks at the genetic potential to make butyrate and propionate and acetate, rather than measuring it as an analyte in stool. But, for what it is. I was really curious too, because I thought, oh God, I'm doomed. And I had just done a Karazian seminar and he talked about butyrate. I was like, oh, I'm going to keel over any minute. So I actually tried supplementing with a couple of different brands of butyrate after getting this test result back. And for what it's worth, I didn't notice a lick of difference in my health, and I track my sleep data, and I'm kind of a nerd. So I didn't notice anything profound from supplementing from butyrate. So I do really wonder if a low number on this is actually reflective of me absorbing it really efficiently and making a normal amount. I don't know. But marching on. And then the miscellaneous category here I think is pretty useful overall. The secretory IgA, we had talked about that in some of the other tests, but that's basically a marker for immune robustness or immune activity in the gut. And if you want to manage your microbes, so that's particularly relevant for the conversation of dysbiosis or SIBO or candida, then you sure as heck want some secretory IgA around. Now, my issue with this actually is that they don't give a bottom end of the range. So it just says that you want to be less than or equal to 857. But like, what if my number was 2? Would that be okay? I would say no. So I do prefer the labs like Genova and the GI map that actually give you like a reference range for it that includes a bottom end of the range, because I do very frequently see low secretory IgA on, say, a GI map, for example. So I do think that should have a bottom. Now, beta-glucuronidase, I think, does not need a bottom. I think the lower the better, and you can see that mine looks pretty good. Of note, beta-glucuronidase should correlate roughly with pH. The lower your pH is, the more acidic your pH, the lower your ability to make beta-glucuronidase. And you can see that that basically matches. My pH is nice and low where it should be, and also the beta-glucuronidase production is pretty low. So that was lovely. Beta-glucuronidase is an enzyme involved in the recycling of estrogen. So if you have more of that floating around, or you have more of that enzyme being made in your stool, you're going to recycle your estrogen more efficiently. And that sounds like a good thing until you start Googling estrogen dominance, and then you realize it could be a bad thing depending on the individual. So that's kind of the short version of the story for beta-glucuronidase. Fecal occult blood, that should kind of go without saying that blood in the stool is not a good thing. pH, like I said, generally speaking, you want an acidic pH in the colon and actually the vagina also. You want those microbes to be making things like lactate and short-chain fatty acids and keeping the pH nice and low and acidic. So pH, I would even say 7.8 is kind of high for a pH range for stool, but that's neither here nor there. But you do want a relatively acidic pH for your stool. Fecal zonulin, this hasn't been super well substantiated in research. I would say if this is high, then you sure as heck have intestinal permeability. But if it's low, it doesn't rule it out. Most of the studies that look at intestinal permeability, and I need to do a video on testing methods one of these days soon, the way that it's typically tested for is either going to be zonulin in the blood or the lactulose-mannitol ratio test in the urine. So fecal zonulin, not super well supported, but it is what it is. If it comes back positive, I would take that to the bank. If it's negative, I don't think it gets you off the hook. And then the fecal anti-gliadin antibody was really a bummer for me to see because as a celiac, I really tried to be pretty mindful of my gluten exposure, but you could see I was getting a teeny tiny bit of exposure somewhere. Now for me, I did this collection on 8/17, and what's funny that I realized after the fact is that I do think I got glutenated in, I think it was late July or early August. I had gotten some takeout from an Indian restaurant down the road, and I ordered like pakoras, and I didn't ask them about the fryer. I wasn't thinking, and I did have back pain that next day, and I thought to myself, oh, I must have gotten glutenated by the pakoras. So I do think I know the source, but it made me a little bit paranoid, thinking, oh God, what if it's at my parents' house, or what if it's somewhere I eat all the time? So I did kind of freak out about that, but I think I identified the source. Similarly, I would say that if you have high anti-gliadin detected in your stool, that antibody, then you could take it to the bank that you're gluten intolerant or celiac or both. If it's low, it doesn't get you off the hook for gluten sensitivity. But again, if it's high, you could take that to the bank. So that's how I would interpret that as well. And now we get into the part of the test I don't like, which is so frustrating because this is the part of the test that I was really optimistic about. The actual gut microbes that they measure. And here was my first thought. When I got this report back and I started really looking at my data and peeling through it, I thought, wait a minute, this is weird. So I look and I'm like, all right, Enterobacteriaceae 20 for the reference range. And mine's high, so that's concerning. But I was like, wait, what is 20? 20%? Like 20% of your microbiota being Enterobacteriaceae would be atrocious. And if mine is 27%, I'm going to like die any minute. That would be terrible. And these are proteobacteria, so that doesn't line up with the phylum level data. So what the heck, man? So I'm looking at this and I'm like, that doesn't make sense. And I'm like, all right, reference range for Akkermansia, 10. I'm like, all right, well, an upper limit of 10% is a bit higher. Usually I'm saying like 3 to 5%, but you know, maybe they're a little bit more lenient. And you know, I'm coming down the list and then I'm realizing I'm like, wait, 20 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10. Like this would exceed 100%. These are clearly not percentages, but they're also clearly not like individual bacterial cells. What the heck am I looking at? So this took a lot of digging. I did a practitioner support call and I asked the woman what the devil these reference ranges were, and she didn't know. So she actually had to look it up. And what she was able to get me, it was helpful for me to understand, but it made me realize the limitations of this test. So I'm going to read to you the snippet that is relevant from the report that she gave me. Reference range and interpretation. Calibration. The calibrator within this test system, are prepared using known standards of bacteria spiked in a stool matrix and has been assigned a correction factor, CF, for the generation of calibrator value and spike recovery. Okay. So they have a calibration factor or a correction factor that they assign to this. Okay. Then it says reference ranges. Reference ranges have been established using a sample cohort comprising of 192 relatively healthy stool samples. The cutoff for the healthy reference range is set between 2.5 to 97.5 percentile, so 2 standard deviations on a bell curve, right? And the high risk range is set to greater than 97.5, 97.5 percentile, and less than the 2.5 percentile as applicable. For each organism tested, the healthy reference ranges are assigned as follows. And they go down the list. And it's like, so we have literally no idea what any of this means. That's my takeaway from it. So what I would share with you is that we know that we cannot compare this test to any other test versus, you know, if I took another test that showed, I'm trying to think of an example, like Thrive, they just give you the raw percentage of the total. And then if you were to add up all of those percentages, they would add up to 100%. Like that's easy enough to understand. Even, you know, something like the GI map, at least they're giving us a number and we can make sense of that number. But this, like, we don't know what the heck they're doing with this correction factor and the calibration. And all right, are these 192 quote unquote relatively healthy stool samples? Are these people that were picked out by the lab? Like, how do you define relatively healthy? Like, are they just like the employees of Vibrant America? Like, how did they determine this healthy cohort of people is the other issue. And then also the fact that the reference ranges are set 2 standard deviations out from the mean. I mean, that's a pretty big spread. Maybe you don't want to be, it's like, yeah, I don't know. I'm spinning my wheels here, but you get the idea. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is that we cannot use this information, really. What I would share with you is that if you have a number that's high or low, what we could take away from this is that yours is particularly high or yours is particularly low. Because again, like, you're now an outlier at the 2+ standard deviation mark if you're being flagged as high or low by this lab. So I do think that the highs and the lows should probably merit attention. But for example, something like this, like a bacteria that looks high, or like you can see here, well, I guess the range is, let's see. Well, I don't have any good examples on this page, but yeah, I just have a really hard time figuring out how to use this data. And then this is not my first rodeo looking at stool samples by any stretch. So I would say, for me, this Enterobacteriaceae being elevated definitely necessitates working on, and I'm actually working on that currently. The Bifidobacterium being low definitely merits working on that. And I've known that for quite some time, that my Bifido tend to be low. I was a C-section baby, lots of antibiotics. I mean, repeated stool testing shows that I have low Bifido. So that's something that I already knew about. Funny enough, this test said that my lactobacillus was fine, which also is a little bit surprising because that hasn't paralleled other tests for me. But anyway, now I'll show you the other issue that I have with this particular test, particularly for the bacteria. Again, beyond, SIBO syndrome, their kind of way of getting around like, hey, we're not diagnosing you with SIBO, but like we're kind of strongly hinting at it. So there's this issue, but believe it or not, this is one of my biggest beefs with this, is that, seeing these bacteria that are correlated or the potential associated risk, this has the potential to scare the bejesus out of people. I mean, where is it? There's another page down here. Where is it? Like literally one of these says stroke. Oh yeah, here's Parkinson's disease, autism, MS, Alzheimer's. I really not comfortable with them putting this on here the more I think about it. And I did have a patient get this stool test, and it was helpful to understand her case, but also it scared the bejesus out of her. She basically, we didn't get a chance to talk about the results for a little while after, like a week or two after. And I joked when I got to that part about the Parkinson's disease, and I was like, I hope you didn't throw yourself into, a spiral of Googling and freaking out and anxiety. And she and her husband kind of laughed on the call, and I was like, oh no, that did happen, didn't it? So I really, I get why they're tempted to do this and like categorize bacteria based on health concerns, but I think that it can make people really freak out. So I'm really hesitant to recommend that. The other thing too is for somebody like me, it made it really complicated to go through and actually interpret the sample. I know they're trying to make it as simple as possible, but like here, for example, all right, here's Akkermansia here, and we're going to scroll up and we'll find Akkermansia also here. And also, probably every page is going to have Akkermansia on it somewhere. But I was getting all befuddled because I was like, wait, did we talk about that bacteria? Did we talk about, did we talk about E. coli? So it was making me feel like really ADHD in my ability to interpret the test, because they repeat bacteria all over the place, and it's just really confusing, like seeing that. Another thing I'll point out also, that I don't know if this is my biggest criticism, but it is something, is I noticed on me, every single item has a number assigned to it. And I find that really suspicious because I've done numerous other stool tests on myself and I don't have everything. Again, I was a very big antibiotic kid, unfortunately, and I've looked and done multiple testing, and there are some genuses and some species that are just gone. And I find it actually a little bit suspicious that this is literally the only test out of many stool tests I've done that shows that supposedly I have everything. Like every single good or medium bacteria I apparently have. And then we get down to the last page, which I'll show you in a second, but that last page is pathogens. But yeah, I'm like really skeptical that that's accurate, because again, it doesn't line up with any of the other testing I've had. So anyway, let's get down to this last page and I'll share that with you and then we'll wrap up. So down here, let's see. Where are you? There we go. Okay, so and then this, now I believe, if I remember correctly, talking to this lab, I believe that I know the rest of the test is 16S technology, which would be very similar to like Thrive, for example. And then this portion of it, I believe, is PCR. So this would be more similar to Genova and the GI map, for example. And you can see they did detect one potential pathogen on me, but otherwise they show, they show the ranges, and this is much more standard, like numbers that we're familiar with, right? Like they just give you, 1.5 times 10 to the fourth power, or 3 to the third power. Like it's much easier to interpret these numbers as opposed to like the weird correction factor, calibration, standard deviation bullshit that they did on the other pages. So at least this portion of it is relatively useful. And then again, they show you parasites, of which I had none, go me. And they do fungi. They break down fungi in a very similar way to the GI map, which is nice. And then they show you the Helicobacter genes. And then you can see too on the bottom, they do give you information about those other different things that they tested. They just don't put it on the report up higher if it's normal on you, but they do give this in the supplementary material. So again, it just kind of kills me that this test has a lot of potential, like a lot of potential. It looked so good, and it's a pretty reasonably priced test for what it actually is looking for. But I found it, like the actual microbiome data, which is why I would be ordering the test in the first place, was just so like not usable. And heaven forbid if I want to do like one test like this and then a couple months down the road recommend a different test to a patient. It just, I wonder if it's almost like a marketing ploy of like, making it so that the test is not comparable to any other test, and therefore they kind of like box you into forcing you to repeat their test if you ever want to get a comparison again. I don't know, but I was really optimistic and excited about this test, and I thought that it looked really, really nice on paper. And when I got my own results back in, I was really disappointed. So I think that the inflammatory markers and a lot of the markers on the first few pages I think are very useful. The phylum level data, the diversity indexes, I think that is useful on the first page. And the pathogens and the parasites and the candida and like yeast species, like all of those that they test with PCR, I think are probably pretty useful. But all of that middle section of the test where they look at the good and the commensal bacteria, which is mostly what I want to assess on my patients 9 times out of 10, that part I found just completely unusable, sadly enough. So I'm afraid I can't recommend this test to anybody. Like I said, it definitely has some pros. So if you already got it done, I do think that there's some information that you could take to the bank, but it's not my favorite stool test. So in future videos, we're going to discuss a couple of the others that I have tested out on myself. I have recently tried out the BiomeFX, which is going to be my next video, and then also a Somagen stool test. And both of those are using a different technology altogether. It's a much more accurate technology called shotgun sequencing. And we're going to talk about that in subsequent videos. And then ultimately, I'm going to break this down to you, the pros and cons of all these tests, and what is my current recommendation as of, basically rolling into 2021 here. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video. Hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, click the like button, and leave a comment down below with the videos that you would like to see me do next. Doing all of those really helps support the channel and support my efforts in making as many videos as possible for you guys. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.